Crisis, decision-making, and war. Crises are important because they may cause war. Especially now that we live in a world of nuclear weapons, there's a concern that a crisis could escalate to a serious conflict. Our concern will be to examine the circumstantial effects of crises on individual decision-making. Here you can see a Russian theater missile launcher. Charles Herman has come up with the standard definition of a crisis. A crisis is a situation characterized by 1. Surprise. Decision makers are caught unprepared, without pre-established routines or standard operating procedures to handle these problems. 2. A high threat to important values. The importance of what the decision maker is trying to protect places urgency on their decision. 3. Short decision time. Responses must be quick, lest the adversary take advantage of the decision maker's inaction. If you've ever been in a car accident, or if you've ever been, for example, robbed, these are events that occur very, very quickly, and in the moment you're extremely surprised, and typically after the moment, probably for days or even weeks, you're questioning how you could have done things differently. It's that kind of trauma that people experience when they're decision makers in a crisis, particularly when they're in charge, they're responsible, because their decisions will affect others and they will be judged. Now, surprise and short decision time impose cognitive limits on the decision makers. 1. Limits on the individual's capacity to receive, process, and assimilate information about the situation. What is actually going on? Did this event or did it not occur? In your experience, is this kind of information a rumor? Is it the type of information that inexperienced people make up when they panic? Or is it genuinely happening? Number 2. The inability to generate the entire set of policy alternatives. This matters, especially since there are no available SOPs. Leaders become very dependent on the advisors immediately around them. They're worried that they don't have access to a solution that a technical expert that's not in their immediate circle could offer them. Number 3, fragmentary knowledge about the consequences of each option. It may be easy to predict what the immediate adversary is going to do, but what about the second country, or a third country, or a fourth country, or different segments of the domestic population, or different advisors within the cabinet? Number 4, an inability to order preferences for all possible consequences on a single utility scale. Because it's difficult to judge the effects of one's actions, it's difficult to assess the payoff for each of the policy options. And so ranking them becomes very difficult. Very often they're just grouped in sort of a Venn diagram. So crises, because of their threat to high values, induce stress. And people handle stress differently. There is, however, mixed evidence as to the effect of high stress on performance. Some argue it has limited effect. Stress tends to matter more when decision makers have centralized control and are highly interactive with their opponent. So here we have a hypothetical set of effects from a crisis. So we can see here the definitions: high threat to important values, short decision time, and surprise. We can see its effect on stress. Now, its effects are, first of all, on attention span, here at the top. You basically don't have a lot of time, so you filter out complex explanations and gravitate towards the simpler processes that can be understood. This then has an effect on selective filtering of information. The schema is going to define the use of the information. It affects cue awareness. leaders are less likely to notice relevant indicators. It leads to reliance on past experience. I did this project, or I was responsible as a minister in this other government and I saw this, and I trust my own instincts more than I do those around me. The second effect is cognitive rigidity. Reliance on your own schema. Now this affects reliance on past experience. It strengthens it. It puts a focus on the importance of the cognitive set, the concepts within the schema. It can lead for tolerance for ambiguity, because you're going to fall back on your schema and you're going to put the schema on top of the facts rather than exploring the facts sufficiently. It leads to stereotyping, reliance on schema indicators. It leads to sensitivity to others' perspectives. This is not a bad thing to a certain extent, but I think it implies others' perspective in your immediate circle, those you trust. And it leads to resistance to pull of closure. Basically, there's pressure to make a decision, but you feel a natural sense that you don't have enough information, and so there's a resistance to finally take a policy position and act. Now, of course, there are errors both ways. If you act too soon without enough information, you'll make an incorrect decision, but time is fleeting. And for the military, there's a huge advantage in moving early. The Lanchester equations show that there's an inverse hyperbolic tan increase in losses for the party that moves slower. So military people don't like war. They simply want to move early in order not to be defeated. There's also effect on time perspective. It looks that time is passing very slowly. This could be a good thing. And it has an effect on the importance of short-run values. You discount the future heavily and are very focused on the next few hours or days, and you're willing to sacrifice future events, cancel important meetings with allies, neglect certain preparations, divest resources and attention from future projects that could in the very long run be key to solving the crisis. And this has an effect on a range of decision-making tasks. It increases the probability of defensive avoidance in the collection of information, bolstering, shifting responsibility, procrastinating, hypervigilance to key indicators. In terms of analysis and evaluation of alternatives and their consequences, it increases the probability again of defensive avoidance, of basically not doing what you're supposed to be doing and delaying. In terms of choice among alternatives, again, defensive avoidance. So we're going to take a look at the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis of October and November 1962. The closest instance in which the US and the Soviet Union ever came to direct military conflict, including the possibility of a nuclear exchange. You can see the Keys, the Florida Keys here, and this is the US. It's Florida. Here's Havana, the capital of Cuba. Here's Guantanamo Bay, which is a US military base. And you can see other islands here, such as Jamaica, Haiti, and the Bahamas, which are quite close to the littoral of Cuba. This is the location of different missile sites. SA-2s are surface-to-air missiles, and they're located throughout the island, from the east to the west. There were cruise missile sites that were primarily anti-ship missiles, including airfields for the Ilyushin-28 Beagle bomber, which are located here and here. There are medium-range ballistic missile sites that were located here and here. And there were air bases for the MiG-21 interceptors. Now there are two missiles deployed, the SS-4 and the SS-6, MRBM and IRBM, and they could reach significantly into the US. And here we have the range of sea-launched ballistic missiles that could have been launched from submarines. So this is the actual list of American weapons at the time. The Americans had a number of Minuteman, Titan, Atlas rockets. If you want to see an Atlas rocket, there's one outside the Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. So the US had a total of 139 ICBMs with a single warhead each. And the Americans had over 144 sea-launched ballistic missiles that came out of submarines. But the strength of the US was its bombers, which gave it incredible flexibility. And that's 1,300 bombers with innumerable warheads. And these bombers could fly home and get more bombs and continue their bombing runs. This is the Soviet list. The Soviets had a total of 84 ICBMs, which included 44 located within the Soviet Union, and then these 40 located in Cuba. So, and even it's under dispute whether the SS-7 and the SS-6 were operational. The Soviets had a total of 72 sea-launched ballistic missiles from submarines, and a much smaller number of bombers that would have had to navigate NORAD's air defense, including nuclear air-to-air missiles like the Genie and the Falcon, that were operated by, among others, the Canadian Air Force. So here's US and Soviet survivable deliverable forces in 1962. And it was an estimate of the equivalent megatonnage, which can be calculated, the total deliverable warheads, and the correlation of the reserve equivalent megatonnage. In effect, it shows that the US had significant firepower superiority. So these are some of the satellite photos. It shows the sheds, the launching structures. This is a theodolite station for measuring the precise shape and location of the Earth necessary to launch a nuclear missile. Here's a bunker under construction. So, a bit of background. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft overflew Cuba and detected the presence of two MRBM sites, medium-range ballistic missiles. Recon flights 3 days later confirmed 36 MRBMs and IRBMs, intermediate-range ballistic missile launchers. This is how the most dangerous international crisis began. Now, it satisfies the definition of a crisis. There was surprise. Decision makers were not prepared for the eventuality of missiles on Cuba. Kennedy was certain that Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba, and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, would not put missiles in Cuba. Number two, a high threat to important values. Missiles on Cuba made the U.S. immediately vulnerable and made Kennedy politically vulnerable to impeachment, because he had promised there would be no missiles allowed in Cuba. Number three, a short decision time. The U.S. needed to act before the missile sites became operational, and the Russian technicians were working furiously to get those missiles operational. And more importantly, before the Soviets discovered that the U.S. was aware of the missile deployments. After either of these points, the Soviets could use the missiles to deter U.S. action. So this is an outline of some of the decision makers. You have, of course, President Kennedy, who was the leader of the United States, as well as of ExComm, which is the executive committee. And the executive committee had 15 members, including President Kennedy, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of Treasury Douglas Dillon, White House Foreign Secretary Coordinator McGeorge Bundy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who's probably here in the photograph. Here you can see McNamara. Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who I think is here, White House staff member Theodore Sorensen, Chief of the CIA John McCone, and Paul Nitze, George Ball, and Llewellyn Thompson. This here is Nikita Khrushchev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and the leader of the Presidium. So Kennedy mitigated short decision time. He did this by instituting a naval quarantine around Cuba, and he thereby slowed down the interactive action-reaction process between himself and Nikita Khrushchev, thereby reducing the likelihood of a rash decision. The Soviets reciprocated by slowing down the advance of their naval vessels on October 25th. Here you can see Soviet ships. Kennedy mitigated premature closure by confirming evidence and encouraging discussion of alternatives within his committee. Now, one of the reasons Kennedy set up the committee was he was inspired shortly before the crisis by having read a book called August 1914 by Tuckman, which was a history of the lead-up to the crisis that caused the First World War. And there was a lot of dysfunctional decision-making that led to the First World War. And so Kennedy was using what not to do from the First World War to guide him in not allowing the Cuban Missile Crisis to turn into a major conflict. There were 6 options discussed, including 1, do nothing, which was ruled out because of the scale of the Soviet provocation. 2, use of diplomatic pressures, which was ruled out as the Soviets would veto anything at the United Nations. 3, secret discussions with Castro, which were ruled out because it was thought that Castro was incredibly hostile after the CIA landed Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs, which resulted in a fiasco because most of the Cuban exiles were defeated in a battle on the beach. McGeorge, Bundy, Atkinson, Dillon, McCone, and Taylor agreed on the need to airstrike Cuba. But McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, disagreed. Now, these 4 were rejected. These 4 options were rejected in the favor of 2 others. 1, the airstrike. Now, while initially the preferred option, the Air Force's inability to guarantee 100% success, which could have been fatal if even one of the missiles was ready to launch, and they were in fact ready to launch, some of them, not the IRBMs, but the MRBMs, the medium-range ballistic missiles were ready. And the second, blockade. And the blockade was preferred because it didn't foreclose other options. You could always revert and then adopt another option. So let's examine the counterfactuals. This here is Curtis LeMay, the commander of Strategic Air Command. So what if the crisis had not been managed well and it had led to war? How badly would the crisis parameters have to have been for that to have occurred? This is very speculative, and almost certainly overstates the true likelihood of war and examines only a few of the many possible paths to a likely outbreak of war. So let's examine the likely outcomes from the perspective of the overly general theories we looked at in the very beginning of the course. So a bit of background. There were some, like Air Force General Curtis LeMay of Strategic Air Command. His command controlled all of the missiles and the nuclear bombers, and he believed that the Soviet Union was weak and that a nuclear war could have brought U.S. victory. He actually went as far as unofficially obtaining a number of nuclear warheads from the Department of Energy and deploying them around the world in preparation for a strike on the Soviet Union. Now, in that, he was partially correct. Most civilian leaders believed that the Soviet Union had built up a large bomber and missile force, termed the bomber and missile gap politically. And these were important issues during the elections. And that the Soviet Union could devastate the U.S. In fact, the Soviet Union did not. It could devastate Europe because it had a great many short-range missiles and the bombers could easily enter European airspace. But only a few missiles in Cuba were functional and could hit Texas and Florida. Had a war begun, perhaps at the outmost 10 million Americans would have been killed, and perhaps 100 million Europeans. But the communist threat in the form of the Soviet Union, communist China, North Korea, Cuba, would have been completely destroyed. And this would have saved half a century of arms racing. Now, LeMay seems somewhat belligerent to civilians, but you have to understand his background. He was a witness to the surprise attack by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese simultaneously attacked the U.S. Air Force in the Philippines and elsewhere. He was the commander of the Air Force under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines, and when the Japanese conducted their surprise attack, they wiped out the U.S. B-17 long-range bombers deployed there. These bombers were meant as a deterrent. They were meant to fly over and bomb Japanese cities immediately in response to any aggressive move by the Japanese. So Curtis LeMay felt that he'd acted too slowly. In part, he probably blamed General Douglas MacArthur for not having organized the U.S. defenses in the Philippines. So he was aware that a surprise attack, particularly with nuclear weapons, would be infinitely more devastating. So he was reluctant to permit civilian control. U.S. military doctrine at the time was also about preemptive attack, which means you attack first if it looks like the Soviets are preparing an attack. And this is what the military trained for. But the Americans didn't have a preventative policy, which was attack them now instead of attacking them 10 years from now. And because the Soviet Union didn't look like they were about to launch, there was no way that Curtis LeMay could argue for an immediate attack. There was no immediate preparation by the Soviets. LeMay wanted to attack for preventative reasons. So let's apply the two general theories of war. Right? There's two of them, like 1, 2. 1. States disagree on the shared distribution of power. Had Curtis LeMay convinced Kennedy that the Russians had very few missiles and no ICBMs, and convinced Kennedy that Russia was posturing, Kennedy might have acted with such overconfidence, and this is the result of premature cognitive closure, that the crisis may have been permitted to escalate. Number 2, war happens when, 1, the status quo becomes intolerable. Had the U.S. felt that the missiles in Cuba undermined its global standing, it might have attacked the Soviet Union. Had the Soviet Union believed that an airstrike on its ally in Cuba would have undermined its credibility elsewhere, it may have responded with similar strikes in Europe. And that would have escalated the conflict and perhaps led to global war. 2. The state preempts a feared attack. If the speed of the escalation had been allowed to accelerate, leading to less time to analyze information, Kennedy may have misperceived a Soviet intention to attack, meaning he thought they were about to attack. And the U.S. would have exercised its preemptive doctrine of attacking first. The Americans called this a damage limitation strike, because you limit the damage to yourself because you destroy much of the Soviet arsenal before they launch it. Even if the Soviet Union had made so much preparation, Kennedy might have interpreted it as if they were going to. The Soviet Union may have taken a similar path. This we call the reciprocal fear of surprise attack, when you have two parties, both vulnerable to surprise attack, believing the other has an incentive to conduct a surprise attack, thereby launch first. We will look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in greater detail when we focus on crises later on. A very important crisis was, of course, the July-August crisis in 1914 that led to the First World War. In World War II, it was more of a bifurcation of a crisis. Some people thought that there was a misunderstanding and were offering mediation, such as the Swedes, who were trying to engage with Hitler to see if there was a possible solution to avoid a large-scale war. However, most of the type of crisis during the Second World War was England and France trying to get allies together in order to resist the German attack, while domestically France and England were struggling to find a common policy. And so it was late in England, for example, that Winston Churchill took over from Neville Chamberlain. Prospect theory. Now, expected utility is a rational approach. It predicts that decision makers will weigh outcomes according to their value to the decision maker multiplied by the probability of success. For example, 10% of $100 would be valued at $10. 20% of $60 would be valued at $12. This is mathematically correct. This is how a robot or a computer would calculate expected utility. Now, prospect theory shows that human cognitive biases distort these logical assumptions. In other words, humans do not calculate in the same way that computers do. We evaluate time and risk differently. So prospect theory offers a theory of decision makers under risk. So conventional political science normally posits what type of risk behavior leaders have. And there's three basic categories. There's risk acceptant, risk averse, and risk neutral. Now these could come from an individual's background, their childhood upbringing, but there are a few hypothesized systematic relations. For example, Adolf Hitler is generally seen as a risk acceptant leader. If you recall, Mearsheimer would say it's not Hitler that was risk acceptant, but rather the situation, which is Germany had an opportunity, which is very rare, to become a regional hegemon, and therefore any leader of Germany would have taken that opportunity. George Bush was seen as risk averse. When the Soviet Union was slowly losing legitimacy and the Eastern European countries of the Warsaw Pact were seeking to become democratic, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania, George Bush was not triumphant. He was very restrained. He never provoked the Soviet Union. He never wanted to make a policy statement that enhanced his popularity but then reduced the chances of Eastern Europe being allowed to gravitate away from the Warsaw Pact. So George Bush is seen as risk averse, very cautious, perhaps too cautious. And he's been criticized for not being aggressive enough in supporting the democratic movements in Eastern Europe in 1989. Hitler was risk acceptant because he knew he was weaker than either the French and the British combined, or the Russians, or the US. But that if he attacked quickly enough before they were ready to create a coalition, he could win. This is a very risky strategy. And it's a very common strategy among individuals who see military solutions, like Napoleon, for example. But there's sort of an alternative, which is that it's the circumstances rather than the personality of the individual that creates the outcome. And this is something to be tested rather than assumed. So circumstances can also generate risk aversity and risk acceptance. Prospect theory, which is based partially on clinical evidence, has found that choices involving gains are risk averse and choices involving losses are risk acceptant. And we know this from the way that gamblers behave. It's very intuitive. Gamblers are more likely to risk regaining money they've lost, and this is very often a disastrous path to complete ruin, than they are in gaining money in a game. Gaining a few dollars, fine. If you lose it, well, not a problem. But if you lose money, you'll be desperate to get that money back. Probably because you're guilty about gambling in the first place, or there's someone else who is going to criticize you for having lost money. This is how gambling addiction occurs. You get forever locked in trying to recapture losses. Now, an example of this is sunk costs during the First World War. Leaders promised at the beginning of the war that the war would be over by Christmas. Now, at the end of that first year, when the war did not end, and when thousands were killed initially without peace, then the politicians shifted. They then promised reparations. They said, well, war would not stop, but once it did stop, we would demand reparations from the other side to compensate our society for the losses we've suffered. When still there was no peace, after another year of war, radical leaders replaced the moderate leaders, and these radical leaders demanded everything. Ultimately, they demanded the unconditional defeat of the opponent. And they were supported by the population, who'd suffered enormous losses and wanted something to show for their sacrifice. If you lose a child or two of your children in war and you have no more children, it is absolutely traumatic. and you demand action. So in the end, there was an irrational search to recoup initial losses. But these losses could never be recouped. Germany was destroyed in the process of the First World War and couldn't afford the reparations that compensated anywhere near the losses suffered by families. So you promise more over time to justify costs, and this is dysfunctional. Now, as many of you noticed, I had you answer an online quiz question regarding a risk in a choice. Now, I think you probably realized that the probabilities in each question are, from the standpoint of expected utility, identical. So it's really about the wording and how it gives the impression of gains and losses. And by wording it as a gain or loss, it affects the reader's risk acceptance. So let me read the policy. Canada is considering 2 programs for dealing with a new disease expected to kill 600 people. If program A is adopted, there's a 1 in 3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2 in 3 probability that no one will be saved. Which program do you favor? If program B is adopted, 200 people will be saved. Now, typically 72% of people choose program A, demonstrating that they are risk averse with regard to gains. The prospect of saving, with absolute certainty, 200 people is more attractive than the risky prospect of equal expected value, a 1 in 3 chance of saving everyone, all 600 people. Now, I have here the results reported for 2001, in which there were 67%. I'm going to continue with that. In 2002, the results were 78%. 2004, 61%. 2007, 72%. 2014, 71%. 2016, 52%. And I've got other results, but I haven't written them in the margin of the notes. I teach the class almost every year. So the results are more or less consistent. People are risk averse based on the wording. In the second paragraph, I have, Canada is considering 2 programs for dealing with a new disease expected to kill 600 people. If program C is adopted, 400 people will die. If program D is adopted, there is a 1 in 3 probability that nobody will die, and a 2 in 3 probability that 600 will die. Which program do you favor? Now, typically, 78% choose program D, demonstrating that they are risk acceptant with regard to losses. The absolute certainty of 400 deaths is less attractive than the 2 in 3 probability that 600 will die. Now, I found this consistently disconfirmed because I think there's learning. In 2001, the result was 52% for program D. In 2002, it's 50% for program D. In 2004, it was 50% for program D. In 2007, it was 49% for program D. So I think people learn when they read the second paragraph that they were fooled. So in effect, a shift in framing has produced a shift from risk aversion to risk acceptance in at least the first paragraph in the valuation of the identical options. It is because of this loss aversion that states are more concerned with the decline in their reputations or credibility than to increase it by a comparable amount. So offensive realism, typified by Mearsheimer and the Tragedy of the Great Powers, where he says that states will leap at the chance to become a regional hegemon, seems to have less evidence for it than the defensive positionalists who argue that leaders are concerned about relative rank and not absolute gain. So leaders don't care the absolute value of their power, they consider their ranking. Where do we rank opposite other powers, and are we falling behind? If a state has recently lost territory, it will accept dangerous risks to recapture it. But states will seek to avoid those risks if it's simply a matter of gain. So risk propensity, therefore, also depends on how the situation is framed. Does the decision maker believe that they are retaking a lost possession or are merely getting something new? So the reference frame, therefore, matters. Decision makers are slower to accommodating losses than they are to gains. The implication of prospect theory is that change is difficult because most decision makers are not risk acceptant. Perceptions and how social history and memory is constructed therefore matter. Does land lost resonate as an old possession? Some nations forget, while others do not. Russia has forgotten that it sold Alaska to the United States in 1867. But China has never forgotten its loss of Hong Kong from the British in 1842. The Russians thought of Alaska as a territory they'd obtained and lost through the routines of colonial expansion and retraction. The Chinese believed that Hong Kong was stolen from them. Some states therefore act quickly to reverse before a fait accompli becomes solidified. For example, had Russia opposed the sale of Alaska just a few years after the sale, it might still be up for debate and be an issue within Russia. When the Russian communists claimed it in the 1920s, its possession by the US was widely seen as legitimate, even by the Russians. There's a Russian leader called Zhirinovsky from the 1990s, and he made numerous comments on retaking Alaska, but it didn't resonate. One of the reasons is that the Americans respected some of the traditions the Russians had left in Alaska. Most of the indigenous people in Alaska had adopted Russian Orthodox Christianity. And so the U.S. made efforts to ensure that there were Russian Orthodox priests available to those communities. Here you can see Hong Kong and Kowloon, the English possession seized as a function of the Opium War. So the endowment effects. The effects of emphasizing losses over gains. If actors in a bargaining situation treat their own concessions as losses and the concessions they receive from their adversary as gains, they will overvalue the concessions they give to the adversary relative to the concessions they receive from the adversary. This makes bargaining success less likely. So if the U.S. agrees to the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and this was a treaty in which Russia and the U.S. both agreed to reduce their scale of missile defenses, the U.S. will lose its ability to deploy a national missile defense and will get in return merely the promise that the Russians won't proliferate nuclear weapons. This is one of the reasons why the treaty ultimately failed in the early 2000s. They also heavily overweigh small probabilities. For example, the belief that the Japanese could hit the U.S. at Pearl Harbor and then win the war. The Japanese exaggerated a very small probability into a moderate probability, which is fallacious. Very high probabilities that are not certain are assumed to be certain. Hitler believed that Russia was weak, very weak, and he turned that very weak into completely weak, into certainty that the Soviet Union could be defeated by a German invasion. You can see those extreme values represented in this chart. You can see that expected utility estimates are the red line, but humans distort at the very low end, at the very high end. At the very low end is virtually a non-existent probability, but humans exaggerate that to a small probability. And at the upper end, where you have near certainty but not certainty, humans give certainty. So changes of probability are more valued at the extremes, whether they're very small or very weak. Now let me give you a sort of a clinical experiment. People are willing to pay far more to reduce the risk of a catastrophic loss from 10% to 0% than from 20% to 10%. Right? That's the same distance of probability according to expected utility. It's a reduction of 10%. Whether it's from 90 to 80, 80 to 70, 70 to 60, it's all the same. But for humans, 20% to 10% still leaves some possibility of a bad outcome, where a reduction from 10% to 0% leads to complete certainty. So it's as if you're playing Russian roulette and you have a gun. And you've got 6 chambers. one of those chambers has a bullet, or two of them has a bullet, or three of them has a bullet, a human is willing to pay a lot more, probably 10 times more, 100 times more, 1,000 times more to remove the last bullet in that gun. While at the same time, if they were to reduce 3 bullets to 2 bullets in that gun, it would have the same effect probabilistically of killing them. But from a human perspective, certainty is highly valued. So more effort is made to reduce the likelihood of accidental nuclear war when it reduces to 0 the chances of the accident than when it does not. Arms control agreements between the US and the Soviet Union to ensure nuclear weapons are stored securely have received much greater efforts, because they're easy and they're efficient, than efforts to contain regional disputes that could escalate to a catalytic nuclear war. Because it's just too difficult. And even though focusing on regional disputes might reduce the escalation of a nuclear crisis to war, the problem is you don't have certainty there, so it's not seen as worthwhile investing in. The reason is that while both policies would reduce the likelihood of war probably equally, storing nuclear weapons safely reduces that cause of war to almost nil, and all causes of war to go down to about 10%. Whereas, although dispute management can reduce accidental war by 50%, which is much greater, it'll never approach the 0% chance of a nuclear war. Now, there are problems with prospect theory, and there's a lot of clinical evidence of individual effects, but we just don't have empirical evidence of this applied in a crisis or in a case study at the international level. So there's a lot of very interesting theories that come out of political psychology. My supervisor, Robert Jervis, is a political psychologist, and so there's a lot of space to examine decision-making structures and the personalities of leaders and how they interact with communications technology to avert crises. And so there's a lot of room for this kind of research. So let's apply this to the case of the Iranian hostage rescue in April of 1980. So give a bit of a background. On November 4th, 1979, in the context of worsening Iranian-U.S. relations during the Iranian Revolution, 3,000 Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, seizing 66 American hostages. The students were hoping to exchange the hostages for the exiled Shah of Iran, who was under cancer treatment, and they did not expect to occupy the embassy for more than a few days. The students were surprised when the Iranian leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, gave his blessing to the seizure, and the students decided to drag out the affair. 13 of the hostages were released on November 18th and 19th, 1980. U.S. President Jimmy Carter immediately began negotiations with moderates in the regime, including Bani Sadr, the Prime Minister, though through French legal intermediaries. At the same time, his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, contacted the Pentagon to begin planning a military rescue codenamed Operation Rice Bowl. Curious information, Zbigniew Brzezinski is a student from Montreal who ultimately went to teach and was a professor at Columbia University and Harvard. And then he managed to become national security advisor to the President of the United States. He is a Canadian. So here we can see the Shah of Iran, who was deposed when the military refused to stop demonstrations in the capital of Tehran. In top right. Top left is the Ayatollah Khomeini, who wasn't the sole leader of the revolution, but was leader of the clerics who led the people in the bazaar and the unemployed construction workers. For example, he was not the leader of workers in the oil industry in the south, who were mostly members of the two-day Iranian Communist Party. You can see the Iranian army effectively deserting protection of the Shah, and then you can see the flag burning in Tehran. Now, we use this case to examine the logic of prospect theory on the decision-making of U.S. President Jimmy Carter over the issue of the Iranian hostage episode in April 1980. This action did not result in war, but it encouraged the type of high-risk behavior that could have if it was done in the context of decision-making. So Carter's frame. President Carter relied heavily upon two very different advisors, his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. Whereas Brzezinski could be described as a devout anti-communist and advocating aggressive foreign policies, Vance was a more cautious policy advisor, due in large part to his negative experience with Vietnam. Carter typically sided with Vance on issues of foreign policy, but following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which came as a complete surprise to him, Carter's schema was radically altered, and he thereafter accepted Brzezinski's assessment of world situations. Brzezinski's schema was of the successful Israeli hostage in Entebbe, Uganda, just a few years earlier. President Carter believed that he was in the domain of losses. He wanted to return to the status quo ante and have the U.S.'s reputation restored, and thereby have the hostages freed. The hostage crisis was also seriously damaging his re-election bid that was going on at the same time. Brzezinski believed that he was in the domain of losses also. The hostage crisis had seriously damaged U.S. credibility and could lead to hostage takings of Americans elsewhere, and the situation was worsening the longer the U.S. did not act. President Sadat of Egypt had warned Brzezinski that he would need to act sooner rather than later. Vance's attempt to condemn Iran at the United Nations was vetoed by the Soviet Union, and Vance managed to convince the Europeans to embargo Iran. Nonetheless, Vance's frame was neutral, since no hostages or Americans had yet been killed, and he believed that Brzezinski's aggressive policy would make the situation worse. Vance's schema focused on the Uss Pueblo Incident of the late 1960s, in which a U.S. spy ship was captured by the North Koreans, but through persistent and patient negotiations, the crew was eventually released. The Pueblo still sits in North Korea as a museum piece. On April 1st, negotiations collapsed with Prime Minister Bani Sadr, and Carter was presented with 5 options. 1. Do nothing. 2. Engage in minimal political and diplomatic sanctions. 3. Undertake a rescue mission. 4. Mine the harbors of Iran, damaging its commerce. And 5. Conduct a military strike, probably with aircraft and ships. So the options. Do nothing. Vance suggested waiting for the situation in Iran domestically to stabilize. Carter believed that the credibility of the U.S. would be drained away and that there would be hostage takings all over the world. Option 2. Engage in minimal political and diplomatic sanctions. Well, this had automatically been done, and there was little clear evidence that it would help bring the hostages back on their own. Number 3. Undertake a rescue mission. Carter knew the risk, but he also believed the costs of doing nothing was high. Option 4. Mine the harbors. This was a volatile alternative that would have pushed the Iranians toward the Soviet Union. They would probably have sent minesweepers into Iranian harbors. This option was of lower risk than a rescue mission, as Americans would be less exposed, but there was no clear link of how this punitive action would lead to the release of the hostages. Choice 5. Conduct a military strike. This was a volatile alternative that would have pushed the Iranians toward the Soviet Union. Iran had a treaty with the Soviet Union that would have permitted a Soviet intervention in the event of a third-party attack. So it needs to be understood that Iran was a victim of invasion twice, both during the First World War, so the Allies could get supplies to Russia, and during the Second World War, so the Allies could get supplies to the Soviet Union. Iran was occupied. In the Second World War, it resisted and was defeated, and then put under occupation. Carter's decision. Options 1, 2, and 4, which is do nothing, engage in minimal political and diplomatic actions, and mine the harbors, were varying levels of low risk and low payoff. Option 5, which was bombing Iran, was inconceivable. Option 3 was both high payoff and high risk, basically undertaking a rescue mission. It could fail, but maybe they could rescue the hostages. Carter chose option 3, and while he knew that there was a great deal of uncertainty surrounding it, he exaggerated its likelihood of success. He also believed that its high risk was warranted by its high payoff. So even though it was maybe not going to work. If it did work, then Carter the gambler would recoup his losses. So he exaggerated it from probably not working to, maybe 50-50, or maybe better than 50-50. On April 11th, Carter decided to exercise and execute the rescue mission for April 24th, 1980, codenamed Operation Eagle Claw. So the plan was to launch 8 RH-53 helicopters from an aircraft carrier, the Nimitz, in the Arabian Sea to Desert 1, a landing field east of Tehran. 6 C-130 transports were to meet them there from Mazira Island in Oman. The helicopters would then fly to Desert 2 south of Tehran, while 120 U.S. Army Rangers and Delta Force commandos stormed the embassy and the Iranian Foreign Ministry, carrying the hostages across the street to a stadium where helicopters would fly them to Mansouriya south of Tehran. There, C-141 transports would fly the hostages out of Iran. All of this would be conducted under the cover of U.S. Navy fighters to make sure that the Iranian Air Force didn't intervene. These are the embassy grounds of Tehran and the location of the embassy within the city of Tehran. So what happened? The rescue attempt failed. 8 American soldiers were killed and 4 wounded. Of the 8 helicopters that left for Desert 1, 2 suffered mechanical failures en route and had to turn around. At Desert 1, there was an additional helicopter breakdown and the mission was aborted. It was at that time that one of the helicopters collided with a tanker aircraft. The mission's failure further damaged U.S. prestige. The hostages were dispersed across Iran and were not to be released for another 9 months after 444 days of captivity. And Carter's popularity plummeted. Cyrus Vance resigned at the time of the decision taken over his opposition to the rescue plan. In retrospect, Vance seemed to have been correct, and Carter and his advisors were wrong. Carter overweighed the small probability that the operation would succeed, despite objections from other advisors in the military. Or either he assumed that what was probable was certain because the payoff was so great. Also, there were warnings during the planning phase from both the US military and the CIA that the plan had a low probability of success, suggesting that Carter had exaggerated the likelihood of a favorable outcome. Admiral Holloway at the time posited only a 60 to 70% chance of success. And this is a low estimation for the required certainty. If Carter had been rational, knowing the full range of benefits and losses, and where he stood within that range, he probably would not have permitted the rescue operation to be conducted.